Chapter 4. A Suspicious Sailor. Frank and Joe sprinted across the field to where Chet was waiting for them. "What's the news from police headquarters about?" Joe demanded excitedly. "All I know," said the stout boy, "is that the department called and said you should report to them pronto." The same thought flashed through the brothers' mind. Was it news of the rubies or Joe's masked assailant? "We're on our way," said Joe, as the Meade caught up to them, the falcon still on his wrist. They hurried to the convertible and drove to Bayport. After leaving the Meade at his shop, the boys headed for police headquarters. Frank remained in the car with the falcon while Joe went inside. Oscar Smuff was waiting for him. "You have news for us?" Joe asked. Smuff nodded. "I saw a man lurking around your garage. Swarthy complexion. Red and white bandana around his neck. He was wearing a tattered felt hat." "Do you mean you caught our hawk thief?" "I don't know if he's the one, Joe. You'll have to identify him, but he certainly fits your description." Smuff led the boy into a small room. A sullen figure slouched on a bench. When he saw Joe, he jumped up. "I'm glad you're here," he said with a slight Italian accent. I went to your house and looked for your lawnmower, and this cop took me down here. I don't know what for." Joe grinned. "Sorry, Nico. It's a case of mistaken identity." Nico looked at the police officer defiantly. "See? I told you so." "Nico's our gardener," Joe explained to Smuff. "He comes every week to cut the lawn." Smuff shrugged and apologized to the man. "That's okay," said Nico, when he heard about the hawk thief. "Now I can go back to work." Since it was nearly lunchtime, the boys drove Nico to the Hardys' home. As Joe carried the falcon towards the back door, Mrs. Hardy appeared and said, "Please don't bring that hawk in the house. It'll only upset your Aunt Gertrude." Frank took the hawk to its perch in the garage, set the burglar alarm, and locked the door. He had just sat down at the table for lunch when Joe appeared carrying a volume of encyclopedia with him. "It says here, most hawks, peregrines especially, require a bath," Joe read. "The end of a cask sawed off to give at a depth of 6 inches makes a good tub. Peregrines, which are used to waiting on, require a bath at least twice a week." "Waiting on? You certainly do have to wait on them," Aunt Gertrude retorted. Frank and Joe exchanged grins, then told their aunt that what the term meant. Frank read on from the book in his brother's hand. "If the bath is neglected, the falcon is inclined to soar when flown, and may even break away in search of water and be lost." Mrs. Hardy cleared her throat with a loud humph, which ended the further conversation about the hawk. After lunch, the brothers made a cast tub for the falcon and let her bathe. Then they laid plans for beginning their work on the case Mr. Hardy had outlined for them. "My guess is," said Frank, that anyone smuggling immigrants into the country would probably do it after dark." "No way." "Let's take the sleuth out into Bayport this evening and scout around for a few hours." "Good idea," Joe agreed. "But remember, Miss Peregrine has to go along." About 7:30, the boys changed into old pants and sweaters, then hurried to the garage. Joe put on the gauntlet and signaled for the hawk to come to his wrist. When the bird was in place, he hooded it, and Frank drove them to the boathouse. After climbing aboard the sleek motorboat, Joe attached the bird's leash to the jest on her legs and set her on a short horizontal pole in the wheel cabin, which was intended for raincoats and jackets. The bird accepted the roost readily. Moments later, Frank had the sleuth under way. As the craft niced smoothly through the water, the boys were pleased to see that the falcon remained quiet. Presently, Joe asked, "What kind of boat do you think we ought to be looking for here?" "I surmise that the smugglers would come close to the 12-mile limit in a large boat," his brother replied. "Then they'd contact the shore and make arrangements to have the immigrants transported the rest of the way in a speedboat." "Sounds logical," Joe agreed. Feeling a drop of rain, Joe looked up at the sky. In the distance, he spotted a pigeon flying towards land. Grabbing the binoculars, he trained them on the bird. Frank, too, had seen the pigeon. Both boys wondered if it was a carrier. "Suppose we let the hawk bring it down to the beach," Joe suggested. It might help us more to know where the bird is going, so we can locate the owner," Frank asserted. "Get the pigeon's directions, Joe." He handed the brother a pocket compass, and Joe balanced it on his hand. Steadily the movement of the settling needle. He studied the movement of the settling needle carefully. Frank and Joe were well aware that carrier pigeons' actions are fairly predictable. When turned loose at their departure point, they fly straight up into the air, circle, pick up the beam of their home cot, and set off in a straight line. By the speed and assurance with which the pigeon overhead was flying, the boys were convinced that it was making a beeline for home. When the bird was finally out of sight, Joe remarked, "That pigeon was heading straight southwest. The question is, how far inland is it going? We'll have a starting point for a search anyway," Frank commented. "Hey, that pigeon in Chet's farm was headed in a southwest direction too." "Right. And now with a possible clue to the smugglers' mainland hideout, let's do a bit of aerial sleuthing. First thing tomorrow." Presently Frank turned the wheel over to Joe. He was just about to head into the ocean when Joe said, "We have company." A deep-sea fishing cruiser was coming towards them from across the open bay. Frank picked up the glasses and read the name Daisy K. The Hardys recognized this as a weather-beaten sports fishing craft used for charter trips. It was frequently tied up in Bayport, but they knew nothing about the owners. "Think she's suspicious?" Joe asked. "Take a look at that sailor leaning over the rail on the sideboard," Frank said excitedly. As the Daisy K approached, Joe adjusted the glasses and peered at the heavy-set, dark-skinned man who had piercing black eyes. Both the man's hands were resting on the rail, and at the first glance he appeared to be just a tired sailor, relaxing after a long day. "What do you think, Joe?" "Same as you do." For a reason they could not explain, the boys felt sure that this was a mysterious masked man who had tried to steal the Falcon. But on neither of his hands were a telltale ruby ring. For the moment the Daisy K had passed the sleuth. "I don't suppose," said Joe, "that we ought to suspect any suntan stranger. I have a funny feeling, though, that he is our man. Shall we follow him?" "We haven't a shred of evidence against the fellow, Joe. And anyway, I know where to find him if we want him. I'd rather keep looking here for clues to the smugglers." "Okay." It was choppy on the open sea, and the darkness settled. The wind grew stronger. "I guess we'd better go back," Frank proposed. "The waves are getting pretty high, and I don't want Miss Peregrine to get upset." The hawk was finding it hard to retain her perch, and finally Frank took the bird on his wrist. "Too bad we couldn't continue our sleuthing," he remarked. "But then it would be impossible for us to get near another boat on a night like this." About half an hour later, the Hardys nosed the sleuth into the slip of their boathouse. Frank set the Falcon back on her pole perch, and had just closed the door behind them when there was a low rumble in the corner of the boathouse. The next instant there came a blinding flashlight, followed by a sharp explosion that rocked the building. A sheet of flame rose up the wall and across the boathouse directly towards the sleuth.